Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. and this first introductory lecture for our course United States History to 1877. And I'm going to take this lecture to talk about some themes and big ideas that we will be following throughout the entire course as we go along. But I want to begin with a few thoughts for those of you especially who may not be history majors or perhaps even coming from outside of the course and watching this from the general public. Just a few thoughts and perhaps pointers in thinking like a historian. So there's something about studying history that's a little bit like watching a movie where someone has already told you the ending. And try as you might as you watch the movie, if someone says everybody dies in the end, well, you're watching the whole film, but you kind of live into that knowledge that they're all going to die in the end, and it's impossible to escape that. Well, of course, when we're studying history, we all know how things turn out. We kind of know at least where we've gotten to today, and so we know how the movie ends. The historian Bernard Bailyn put it this way. He said, "By our explanations, interpretations, assumptions, we gradually make it seem automatic, natural, inevitable. We remove from it the sense of wonder, the unpredictability, and therefore the freshness that it ought to have." So as historians and as students of history, we have to kind of trick ourselves into forgetting that we know how the movie ends. We need to rather kind of live into what people in that time knew and understood. Why did people act in a particular way at that time? Well, they don't know how the movie ends. They don't know how this is going to turn out. So Bailyn concludes, try to understand the world not as it anticipated the future, but as it was experienced by those who lived it. Now, another point in terms of thinking like a historian is to bear in mind that history is more than just, quote-unquote, the past. Now, there is a definition of history, perhaps the simplest one, is that history is the past, or history is events of the past. Well, if that were true, then one textbook about history would pretty much do it, right? Now, it would be a long one, but one book could just tell us what happened in the past, and that would be it. But really, history as a scholarly pursuit, certainly history as a profession, is much more than just the events of the past. History is a debate. History is a discussion. History itself is constantly evolving in the way that we think about it. So, of course, the events of the past themselves don't change, but the way we think about them changes. The way our current understanding of the world changes, and thus the way we think about the past changes. I always talk about the example of Abraham Lincoln, the most written about figure in American history. There are some 16,000 books about Abraham Lincoln. Well, if history was simply the past and the events of Lincoln's life, then one book should do it. But history is about how do things change over time? How does our interpretation of Lincoln change? What are the various aspects of his life that maybe were overlooked for a time and now suddenly become important? Our access to different sources changes over time. Maybe someone has uncovered a new treasure trove of documents that no one knew about before. Our thinking about society changes. For much of our history was written by and about white men. Well, now, of course, we pay much more attention to African Americans, minorities, women, other ethnic groups, the poor, immigrants, and so on. Those were groups that didn't even show up in the history books for many, many years. So, who knows what history will look like 50 years from now or 100 years from now? There will be whole new ways of thinking about society and the world that will require perhaps another 16,000 books about Abraham Lincoln. Okay, let me give you a few themes and things to think about as we embark on our course about early American history. One of them is kind of related to that, the fact that history changes over time, and I would refer to this as contingency. If we're not careful, we can fall into the trap of just assuming that things were always going to work out the way they did, that the colonials would overthrow the British, that we would write a constitution that would become permanent, that the American form of government would last forever, that the North would win the Civil War. All of these things kind of look inevitable if we're not careful about it. But we have to keep in mind that the people living in that era didn't know how things were going to turn out, and that history is filled with right-hand turns when perhaps we could have turned left. I'm always reminded of the Bugs Bunny cartoon. I knew I should have took that left turn at Albuquerque, the line that he repeats in so many of those cartoons. And by the way, if you are too young perhaps to have watched Bugs Bunny, check out some of those cartoons and you'll get a sense of what that line means. So we need to kind of pay attention to those possibilities, the contingencies in history. Now there's actually a whole subfield of history, this kind of what-if history where scholars embark down that road. What if the South had won the Civil War, for instance? I don't so much go in for that, but we do have to keep in mind that there were always other possibilities, that things didn't necessarily have to turn out the way that they did. Another one of the themes that we're going to be exploring as we go through this course is the constant kind of push and pull between immigration on the one hand and nativism on the other. Nativism being the kind of fear of immigration, the insistence that the people who are here already are the ones who have all the right answers, and it's immigrants who are the source of all of our problems. Now, this is clearly a 21st century issue, right? We have these kind of conversations even in current events. But it was also a 20th century issue, a 19th century issue, an 18th century issue. All throughout our history, there is this kind of pull and push going on between immigration on the one hand and nativism on the other. Another theme that we're going to be exploring throughout this course is the idea of the United States as kind of a grand experiment, a unique experiment that is sometimes known as the city on a hill, in the words of John Winthrop, who was describing colonial New England. But the thought of the United States as unique runs strongly throughout our history. It's not just in that colonial era, and we will revisit it many times. And in fact, our country is unique in a lot of different ways. We now have the longest lasting democratic form of government in the history of the world. The rights and freedoms and privileges that our people enjoy are largely unique from anywhere else on the globe. And so we will talk about and kind of revisit these elements of American history that create a unique nation and a unique form of government. And a final theme that we're going to be coming back to over and again throughout this course is the idea of various founding documents and also the quote-unquote founding fathers who really kind of established this country. Founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, with its famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Constitution, with its famous opening words, "We the people," ensuring us that our government works to the benefit of defending and helping the people. The Federalist Papers, which hashed out how this new form of government would work and ultimately led us to the Bill of Rights, perhaps among the most important elements of the Constitution. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which set us on the road to abolishing slavery and bringing equality to all Americans. Now, these documents are seared into our national memory and our national identity, which I talked a little bit about in the previous introductory lecture. And yet, we cannot allow ourselves to sear these founding documents and the founding fathers into this kind of pantheon of gods, that they are perfect and flawless. So, as one last kind of thought, this course is not all about the founders. It's not all about those founding documents or the founding fathers. We will talk a lot about those things, and in some ways the Revolutionary War becomes the hinge around which the whole course will kind of ebb and flow. Everything prior to the revolution, sort of leading up to it, and everything after the revolution, building out of it. And yet, we will talk about the Founding Fathers as real human beings. They were, after all, just men. They were human. They made mistakes. They were imperfect. They were flawed. And we will talk about that. And of course, we'll talk much more about other elements of our history. We will talk about slavery and African Americans. We will talk about women. We will talk about immigrants. We will talk about the poor. And so this is not a course just about looking at famous paintings and famous sculptures of these deities known as the Founding Fathers, but rather of our entire nation and its early history. So, I invite you to return for our next lecture when we will start to get into the content of this early part of our history, and beginning, by the way, not with Columbus in 1492, but somewhere in modern-day Siberia about 20,000 years ago. I'll see you next time.